Welcome to this special webinar with Kinetic IT and hosted here with MySecurity Media. This is securing critical infrastructure at scale, integrating vulnerability response into service delivery. Critical infrastructure providers across federal, state and defence sectors face increasing pressure to modernise their operations securely and consistently. This session will explore how an enterprise-wide approach to cybersecurity and service management enables better outcomes by aligning data, standardising processes and integrating vulnerability response. You'll gain insights today with real-world use cases and learning practical strategies to drive secure digital transformation at scale, and I think at scale being the key term. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor and director with MySecurity Media. This is the second Kinetic IT webinar that we've done. The last one was in November, pretty much again focusing on critical infrastructure protection, and again you'll gain great insights from the Kinetic IT team, and please use this session to use the session for Q&A and questions. On that, the protocols, this session is being recorded. The recorded session will be available within the next 24 hours. Again, please use the Q&A for your questions. That way we can sort of dictate as to what questions we respond to and come back to them if we don't happen to get to them. And we've allocated 60 minutes duration for this particular session. We are national, so we'll pay tribute to our traditional owners across the country and pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging. I'd like to welcome our panel now, Dan Spada, the Principal Service Integration with Kinetic IT, and he's in Sydney but Perth-based. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And you can unmute yourselves, gents. Tony Campbell, Principal Security Consulting and Advisory with Kinetic IT there in Perth, and many of our audience should know Tony. Tony, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Chris. Hi, everyone.
Good on you. I'll save the best till last, actually. So Richard Cook, also there in Perth, Senior Consultant Service Integration with Kinetic. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everyone.
And Murray Thompson, AM and CSC, Group Executive Advisory and Transformation there with Kinetic, and you're in Canberra, Murray. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Great to be here, and I'm feeling the daggers from the other panelists with that slight saying the best to last. No, not at all.
Okay, nice. Well, look, you're on the back of a promotion there, as it happens, Murray. Just flick to the next slide if that's working for me. It's going to kick over. But I think you're going to set the scene for us, really, at the end of the day, given the scale and your history there, particularly in defence and extensive cybersecurity experience. Maybe let's start with the scale problem and describe sort of the role that you had in the past and sort of just, yeah, again, the grapples with scale in this context.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Appreciate the introduction. Hey, it's great to see so many people online today. Look, if you haven't read the blurb, I finished up a year or so ago in defence, and where I oversaw the operation of the global networks, communications networks, satellite networks, the terrestrial, the submarine networks, but also the cybersecurity overlay for all of that. So I guess if you're having a look at it, I can happy to set the scene, and we might talk about my role at the end. And this is not a rank advertisement, but there might be some interest about why someone with my background decides to come and join a company like Kinetic IT. But if I put myself back in the past and look at where I was sitting a year ago or so, I think the landscape hasn't changed too much, but it is a hugely moving feast. If at its root, information technology is your business these days, and your approach to it really is important. If you're a senior exec, you need to actually looking at your IT infrastructure as an absolutely fundamental part of the business, if not central. Because without that, you don't connect to your customers, you don't get your point of sale machine working, you don't actually reach out with your marketing teams, you don't actually run your business line operations, or even just the medium that we have here at the moment. Now, overlay the impact of AI, and since OpenAI launched ChatGPT several years ago, it's just unbelievable. The expansion of the use of AI, and there's been a certain level of pickup, which everyone's pretty talented who's on this call at the moment, and you would know that obviously an application like ChatGPT, which has had the most dramatic increase that any application taken on, and then the iterations of that, everyone using Copilot, etc., like that. Businesses, however, if they want to run these operations successfully, if they actually want to get the insights that AI will provide them, and that's all about decision quality insights, you need to have your data arranged. You need to be able to have a safe and secure platform in which to actually operate all of this. And if you are going to bring AI into your capability, what access are you giving the tool sets, etc., to your data? What are your security protocols? And I know I'm preaching to the converted, but the challenge for business executives is that, and all of them are very ambitious and seeing the benefits that things like AI and other key digital uplifts are bringing. But if you're not spending the money on your infrastructure, then you're really not making the journey as well. And so you have this sort of, the ambitions may not meet what your budget is. And so you need to go into it, completely eyes wide open. So that's the first sort of key takeaway is that, you need to, I think, the modern executive there needs to actually view their IT as their business platform. As a former soldier, I can tell you that IT is absolutely fundamental to your warfighting system. If you want to send a telemetry for that missile to track and take out that ship on the, 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers away, it's actually IT that's actually joining it from the command system, the intelligence system, etc. And that just gives you one example. But to do that, it's not all about the weapon platform, which is, of course, the sexy, shiny thing which says sell. In the end, it's your IT backbone and your infrastructure and your intelligence IT systems in the background. If you're not spending the money on modernising your infrastructure, then, you really aren't going to realise those gains. Number one lesson. Number two, the threat landscape is just increasing exponentially all the time. Having run cybersecurity for defence in the past, you can imagine the areas of threats, the everyday threats that all of you will face, interest groups, fraud, etc., phishing, malware, etc. But, we also have the state-based actors as well. And you might think that your state-based, actors aren't interested in you. They may well be, because your system might be connected to another piece of critical infrastructure, or your system might actually be connected to a government agency, and your logistic tracking system you might operate in the back end, in which you then send up your telemetry. All of that is an egress point into not only your capability, but an egress point into perhaps your clients and your own customers' pieces. So if you don't have a safe and secure security overlay with that, and what your threat landscape looks like, you're going to have some difficulty. It's a real challenge for CIOs out there to put all of that together. And the only thing is that you could invest all the money you want in the world in having a fantastic SOC capability, and you can invest all the money you want in having an absolutely fantastic cyber visibility across all of your cyber terrain. But quite frankly, if you haven't got decent system administrators who are actually keeping the patching, etc., if your cyber hygiene of every person is clicking on sort of various malware things that appear in it, then you're going to have problems. It really is an integrated approach, which is the whole point of today's webinar. And I guess what it is, if you look at IT, it's a team sport. You've actually got to look at the whole ecosystem and bring that together, which comes to lastly just the point on my role at Kinetic IT. I've just been appointed I'm reading it off the screen. I can't remember even what it is. The group executive for advisory of and transformation. But, really, we're all about actually bringing three critical practices together. That's your digital automation, your digital transformation, and your cybersecurity all together as three separate practices, so that when we deal with clients, we can give them a whole through life and comprehensive support, managed service support package for your own IT, not just penny pinching on various areas. And we can give you a much more comprehensive package. Hey, advertisement over. Apologies, but I think it's an interesting thing.
Look, no problem. And look, again, you're all seasoned professionals here. But Murray, one thing I wanted to kind of get it from you is just the challenge of visibility. Because when we talked about scale and the breadth, and you're talking about sort of OT and IT systems there, how did you sort of grapple with system visibility? And it's something we'll talk about over the whole session. But yeah, how much of a challenge was that to gain that visibility across platforms?
Bonkers. 144,000 users, people all over the globe, 11 data centers, 57 ships all running separate data centers, 330 odd different servers in the field. Now, I'm not talking fields in our data centers. I'm talking about in tents on the back of armored vehicles, driving data centers, etc. Then you've got your ecosystem of industry all joined together, delivering critical pieces, often at secret levels, for F-35, etc. And then we also have our allies and partners that are accessing our own systems, for the operation of, the US atomic fleet in the Indian Ocean. So, an extraordinary large, what you might characterize, threat landscape. How do you get visibility of it? You really actually need to know your network to do it. Those basics of a basic CMDB, a really rigorous SIAM process across all of your support vendors, a service management overlay, and a change process there. That's before you start to actually then get your cybersecurity tool sets on it. And, quite frankly, you're never going to get the size of that network it's, really difficult, because even just the telemetry coming off that is too much for your 24/7 SOC sometimes. So you really got to point it at the key pieces of vulnerability in a network. And that's the job of us as, IT professionals, to know where the vulnerability points are and ensure that your tool sets are aligned with where the threat, aligned with your threat picture. It's the only way to do it. That's obviously just about capacity, but the other thing is also cost. If you're going to invest in some of these tool sets, where it's consumption based, or you're paying egress costs as well, you're actually then going to start to pay for your costs or part of capacity that you don't need. And then, and then the last thing is too many tool sets choke your network.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, the key point here in this particular session is integrating vulnerability response into service delivery. It's that vulnerability response, I think, is a key factor. Tony, from you, in terms of monitoring the threat landscape, and you've been writing extensively on this as well. Maybe, again, and the key term here is scale also. For these larger enterprises, and as Murray sort of pointed out, it's bonkers. I think the term was bonkers in terms of that scale. How does that match with the threat landscape, and then the vulnerability response component as well?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, the threat landscape, as always, is huge, and it's increasing. And one of the problems that we've got is the speed of transformation of some of these new technologies coming through is changing everything we do. If you take artificial intelligence, if you take some of the IoT type devices that are springing up, we're automating cars, we're putting self-driving vehicles. There's such a large change and rapid speed of change going through in the IT industry at the minute that the ability for security teams to keep up, to understand them, to build controls, and then be able to do things like build a process around vulnerability management to make sure that large language models are being patched on time is just really difficult. One of the problems we've always had with vulnerability management is keeping up with the number of findings that we get coming out of the tools. So if you take a typical vulnerability management scanner, your Tenable or your Qualys, it'll give you everything from highly critical vulnerabilities through to informational, stuff that you could implement, but it's an improvement. But the problem is vulnerability management itself. It's not a broken process, but it's buried under way too much data. So we end up with a bunch of things that we tell our patching people to go and sort out, but there's no prioritization in that demand of that other team. And also quite often the data is incomplete. So we may end up sending 1,000 requests or service tickets over to an end user computing team or a server team to say you have to patch all this stuff. But in there might be Java things that are appropriate to an application development team, and there's a sub team inside that team that actually need to be the people who assess it and actually make the decision about how they're going to patch it. So without all of the right routing of information to the right people, again, you're adding bloat to the process and you're slowing it down. And as a result, because of the technology change and that flow through that we were talking about a minute ago, it's impossible to keep up. So we're literally drowning in data, and the urgency around doing some of this patching, this vulnerability management, the patching in particular, is greater than it's ever been before.
Yeah. Well, one of the terms we've had is solving today's problems while tomorrow's problems are arriving. So yep. I suppose it's you're sort of not so much drowning. Dan and Richard, we'll come to you first, Dan, but just the service delivery again, and how Kinetic IT applies its service delivery here, because it's not so much patching vulnerabilities, it's just responding and monitoring vulnerabilities in their priority, right? So yeah, how do you go about that, and what are sort of the service delivery components of that?
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Chris. And I suppose a bit of context for everyone. I'm not a cyber guy. I come from more of a service management lens. I've spent the best part of the last 20 years working in all things ITIL and service management, and in the last kind of 18 years, quite focused on the technology side of IT service management. So my history has been designing ITIL processes and building those technical solutions. And I think one of the things that I've really started to see, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, is that introduction and adoption of enterprise service management, about having this kind of connected enterprise view of our entire technology landscape and really having that visibility across the enterprise. And I suppose when I think about that in terms of a vulnerability management lens, it's always been treated as a bit of a separate activity. It's something that was a quarterly review or something that happened after an incident. And I think it was Murray that mentioned it, right? The scale of the threats today, like we can't use that same approach anymore, right? We need to integrate that vulnerability response into the everyday service management lifecycle that we all follow every single day, right? And I think that's amplified by the need to align with things like SOCI and Essential 8. And I think as I kind of reflect on the tools that exist today, I think it's really about trying to remove that swivel chair problem, and what I mean by that is where we have vulnerabilities that are identified in one system, in your scanning tool, but then the remediation happens somewhere completely different. That could be your patch management platform, or even your IT service management ticketing system. And I suppose, the challenge with that is it introduces delays, it introduces human error, it's manual effort, and ultimately when we distill it right down, it introduces additional risk to these organizations. So from my perspective, the way I like to look at it is, the introduction of these detection and also the remediation into a single platform, we start to eliminate and close that gap. And, Kinetic IT works very closely with platforms such as ServiceNow that can do that and ingest all of that data, prioritize these vulnerabilities, based upon context that we know, where we've got that information around, what's the impact, what's the issue, what does this relate to? It provides that context for these vulnerabilities that come in and really empowers these delivery and fulfillment teams with the right information to make the right business decision. I think that the second part there is just around the automation of those vulnerabilities. It's all well and good to have that context and that visibility, but the sheer volume of the vulnerabilities that we're seeing within organizations today is overwhelming. And, the ability to do that manual triage is just not feasible for most organizations. So, with the introduction of some of the technology that's available with these tools, you can start to group vulnerabilities, assign them to the right teams, even start to populate the remediation steps and fulfill them automatically. And I think it's that reduction in noise, so that teams can focus on the things that matter most, provides the most business impact to customers today.
Well, it's a good approach. Even back to what Murray mentioned in terms of automation, transformation, and then cybersecurity is that layered approach. Richard, probably more on the technical side here, and prioritising those fixes, the technical urgency versus the business risk. And even at my desk, I'm seeing critical alerts coming out all the time. Even just over the last week, there's been 2 critical alerts on systems. How do you balance the business risk versus those technical urgencies?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Similar to Dan, I spent a lot of my time in that enterprise service management designing it, but it's been more that recently in that consultative level of how do you connect those teams, connect those silos. So where you say with the criticality, so as Tony mentioned, multiple scanners, Qualys coming in or Tenable or Clarity for your OT networks, and they even rate their criticality different. So by being able to bring that into a central platform, work predominantly with ServiceNow, we've been doing the workflow and the automation in the enterprise service management space for quite a while. How do we bring that discipline and that into vulnerability response is being able to do things like normalize those scores, but where you might just see that criticality score, talking to a customer recently about how they're actually solving this problem. How do they solve that swivel chair problem of a high volume, and they're only dealing with CVSS of 9 or 10. But that item, how is that? Technically, that's a high risk, high criticality, but is it a high business risk? That item, is it actually hitting a business critical system? What is the severity? What is the response? So being able to bring into the risk calculation more than just that criticality score from NVD, from Qualys, from Tenable, from any of your scanners, but apply some business context to that as well so you can prioritize your risk better. Has that exploit, does it actually exist within your network? What is the business criticality of the systems that it's hitting? What is the skill level of the people required? So bringing in additional threat intelligence from other systems like Showdown and that to understand, what is actually going on? How does that work? Not just from a technical context of I've got a criticality 10, we must patch them all fast. But if that's on one single server in the dev environment, you could isolate it. You can put in mitigating controls really quickly. It might sit in an isolated network that's not publicly exposed. So is it publicly exposed? Is it only internal? So being able to bring in all that additional information that comes from things like Murray has mentioned, having a good CMDB that understands this data, that is beyond a collection of the items, the widgets in your environment, how they connect, but adding in that business context and layer to it. What business applications are they underpinning? What business capabilities and critical systems? Is this actually my payroll system, my finance system, or is it monitoring on a dev system that maybe isn't as critical to get done? So you can prioritize that remediation work and automate it better by actually understanding the broader context than a raw criticality score that comes from a lot of the scanners.
And I take it you need to match that to the threat intel. So you might have a workflow or a sort of a business case there for certain either patches or fixing other vulnerabilities, but that threat intel should also drive that. So we've seen recent examples where, third-party suppliers have been sort of breached and the like. How do you keep on top of that? Maybe, Tony, to you in terms of the threat landscape and the threat intel versus current workflow and automations that have been applied, probably at Richard's level. Yeah, how do you match the two? Because you've got to be alive to, we talked about sort of tomorrow's problems arriving today, with social engineering and AI exploits as well. How do you tend to advise clients on matching the two? And I might bring up our quadrant here to talk to the scale of the landscape as well.
So just before Tony jumps in, I'm just tying that into that automation piece that Dan's talking about, is being able to automate the ingestion of that data and linking it so that there isn't that human need to do it. So doing that through systems of action workflow platforms like ServiceNow or other solutions, bringing that all into one central place that you can automate that relationship of the threat intel to the vulnerability to that weakness to understand if it's there.
And is that sitting in the SOC, Richard, or where's that sitting?
It does depend on the team. It sits in the SOC in terms of within there to vulnerable on the vulnerabilities to actually understand what is it, prioritize, group them, define your remediation tasks and assign them out, but then assign that out to the teams that actually are responsible. Where Tony mentioned earlier about the patching, you might actually need to have the patching even on one single server, that the Windows patches to secure Windows critical issues need to go to the Windows team, but there might be some stuff around network or security rules that also need to go out. So you can actually break it down at a granular layer, have granularity within a single CI to route those vulnerabilities depending on the type of vulnerability to the right team for action or automation without needing to sift through that data manually. So being able to really finally get into that through an automated workflow platform, and have that time, so where you free up the time from people manual swiveling is where we can then talk to people like Tony in that consulting about how do you tune these tools right for your context.
Yeah. So configuration, Tony, could be a key factor there.
Yeah, it certainly is a key factor. I mean, I think the thing to remember when you're looking at automation, if you do automation without context, all you're doing is speeding up the chaos that you've already created, right? So one of the things you really need to consider is, what is it you're automating and what are you trying to get out of the other end of it? If the purpose of this is to reduce the number of vulnerabilities that your IT team have to react to, urgently, to allow them to do other activities that are more important for the organization. If we can do that, by deprioritizing, say, 80% of the noise that they're having to deal with that are sitting in those queues, it allows them to then go and do the other things that are still urgent and still need to be done. And it's the same with the security team. If we've got a finite number of resources sitting in the SOC doing vulnerability management, if we build automations that are able to ingest 80% of the data that we're talking about, do that automatic categorization processing, starting with the CVSS scores that come out of those tools, that's really just the starting point. After that, then you need to apply context. And without business context, none of this really works. So as the guy said, the CMDB is really important, but there are a couple of simple rules that you can just take. It's like, is it externally facing? I think, as Richard said, if it's external and it's a high CVSS score, patch it. If it's a low CVS score and it's external, stick it in your queue and patch it a little bit later. If it's got an external exploit already available, and the tools can tell you this. So if you take Tenable, for example, the data that it produces will say there's actually an exploit in the wild, so this can be exploited. So if it's external and it can be exploited, then you better do it right away. So that's how you're kind of prioritizing things. And just by doing that very, very simple change into how you do vulnerability management will save you a lot of time. And that's where it comes back to the threat environment then. We know we're getting attacks from phishing, from social engineering, from AI prompt injections, thank you. All the things on this slide are where those kind of threats are coming from. And if you've got, as I said before, you've got finite limited resources in your vulnerability management team, if you're taking away a lot of that noise that's coming out of your scanners, which are, they're not covering everything on this page. They're only covering the IT systems that they're scanning. It allows your vulnerability team to start looking at some of the things around threat intelligence, around deep fakes, about AI application compromise. Those are the things where you're going to get more value out of your security team actually looking at how are those threats going to affect me? And then they can start to build the right advice into the organization to do something about it. Look at different controls that might need to go in there and work with the security architects, work with the other, the business architects, the enterprise architects, to figure out how we build more cross-functional controls that are allowing us to cut some of this stuff down so we can reduce that noise. If we just keep dealing with if we keep dealing with the amount of vulnerabilities we've got today, we just don't have the bandwidth in those teams to be able to do that kind of work.
Bandwidth is a key one. Is it a Pareto principle? If you do 80% right, you knock out sort of only left with sort of 20% of the risks, or are these quite specific in their approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that, Chris. It is exactly that. I mean, if we were to put a couple of simple rules into that process. As I say, if you look at it from a, is it external? Is it exploitable? Those two factors alone will give you, 80% reduction in the amount of work that your team has to do that you could categorize as urgent. And that's the thing. If everything is critical, nothing is critical, because it's all sitting in. Exactly right. So that's what it is. It's about getting the right context and making sure that the automations that you're putting in are actually reducing the workload on the people that have got multiple other activities that are all sitting in that urgent queue.
Nice. And look, we'll go to Dan and Richard just for a couple of case studies in terms of potentially touching on some of these threats and how they've helped clients, but it's a good segue for the audience. If you've got some specific questions or a case study or something specific, you've got some senior consultants here that can assist or at least guide the discussion. We're happy to take it in that direction. But maybe, Dan, you've got a good case study for a critical infrastructure operator and applying that service delivery approach.
Yeah, look, before I jump into that, Chris, I think probably we've kind of alluded to it in terms of the conversation that we've had, but this isn't just a technology problem, right? I think, when I look at my background and where I've focused in the past, technology alone doesn't solve vulnerability response. We need the right people, the right people following the right processes and the right people following the processes supported by technology. Otherwise, these platforms won't deliver the outcomes that that people hope they would. And when we look at vulnerability response, particularly in the landscape that we see today, vulnerability response is very much a cross-functional effort, right? It requires your SOC, your security teams, IT operations, your governance functions often involved, and even senior stakeholders within different business areas. And it's actually about alignment, and if we're not aligned, vulnerabilities and risks will start to emerge, and that has obviously pretty devastating consequences for some organizations. So, while we can look at the technology, I think we really need to make sure that everyone understands, in the entire security landscape, from, the identification and assessing of risk right through to, patching, compliance reporting, and all of those items as well. And I think really what underpins that is having that really strong process. That's going to bring the right order, the right accountability across all of our teams, so that when adverse things happen, we can operate in a structured, well-defined and pre-approved way. Because when these things happen, context is king. We need the right data to make the right sort of decisions in a really timely way. So much of the technology, the contemporary technology that's being used today, will give you information around criticality of these vulnerabilities, the ownership, where it sits within the business, the service impact of these things as well, so that the operators and the analysts can make the right business decision with the data that's presented to them. And I think the other thing for me, being very much a service management guy, is really being able to integrate that knowledge and expertise into that service management landscape. So how do we understand the impact of these vulnerabilities in the context of ITIL processes, such as change enablement, incident management, problem management? So, I mean, at the end of the day, we want to be able to integrate vulnerability response so that it helps facilitate the speed that vulnerability response requires, but still have the right protection around the services that we have, visibility about what services are impacted, so that the rest of IT, those on the service desk, understand what's impacted by these vulnerabilities that are coming in. I think, and those processes, right, they need to be clear, they need to be documented, and they need to be repeatable. Automation and technology can only accelerate what we've already defined at a process perspective.
Dan, we're going to come to a case study, but there's a couple of questions here I thought we might go to first.
Sure.
And then I think either any of the panel can take these, but maybe Richard and Daniel specifically. So this one's from Ken. Fighting the integration fight in our agency at the moment, as the security program has been remiss to identify core ITSM cross dependencies or dependencies needed to deliver deliver value? Am I saying? Oh, here we go. Sorry, see more. Do you have an operating model to demonstrate the intersection dependencies across the two practices? So the security program versus the ITSM dependencies. Is there something that you can address there in terms of that operating model to sort of visualize or get visibility across those dependencies?
Probably not
Richard?
such as an operating model we can visualize, like Chuck Ember to talk to, is it's about kind of breaking down those silos we talked about right at the start. Is that the security teams, when you ask me that question, is like which areas is it the SOC that's doing that? It's having those teams as part of the broader enterprise service management, because as we've alluded to and talked about, that it's that team is looking at the vulnerabilities, understanding the security landscape, but they're 9 times out of 10 not the ones actually remediating the vulnerabilities. So how do you bring that in right from? So if we take bringing it into service design, and ITIL is right from the start of service design. So we're talking a lot about vulnerability response here, but how do we actually also bring it into service design to not introduce those vulnerabilities in the first place and have this as design of our solutions and systems that are going in? So an operating model where those people are involved in the decision making. So security are involved, and I'm working with, and I won't use some names, but I'm working with some customers at the moment where security starts at the beginning. There's security reviews, SRO assessments right at the very start of designing anything, all the way through projects and process, and they become a part. They're not a team that sits to the side. They're actually part of the holistic organization, and that's where, having worked in this a lot, there's always been that security team that sits to the side, or the SOC that sits off in the secret room that's got the closed doors and no one can see. And then all they do is throw something over the fence. We need to fix this critically. But making them part of the culture, the company, everything. So as Dan said, the people part is not just about them being connected in the process, but also being part of the culture of the organization, so that they're understanding the impact of what they're doing. When they throw over something critical, how does that impact? Why do they get pushed back from the cloud team that has to deliver that patch? Because they've got their own list of critical stuff. So outside of them being an operating model as well to help break down their silos, is making them part of the organizational culture to ensure that they're not that secret squirrel team that sits off there. They're actually part of the bigger picture as well. Helps to break down those silos in terms of design of the processes, so that they're actually efficient and are considering everything across.
Well,
Hope that answers the question.
It does, and if Murray's there, I'd bring him back on at that point, because I think defence probably does that better culturally, understanding what the risk is in that culture. Murray, maybe I'm not sure if you grabbed Richard's last part, but we're just talking about integrating that security teams into the business teams, right? There shouldn't be a silo mentality between security and the business itself. They need to be integrated and working as one.
Yeah, no, it's a really great point. Look, it's an interesting case study for defence, and I'm going to overshare here for us, trusted souls on there, all no doubt, highly cleared. But look, I came into an environment in defence where, and I gave you my first-hand experience about, being that sort of business leader at the start, where if you're not spending the money on your infrastructure, you're not valuing your IT team as a critical part of the team. And I must say, I came into defence, into, more recent roles in the last 5-10 years, having been a soldier out on the field, into sort of more strategic ICT, to discover that it was really viewed within the department as along with HR and finance and sort of enablers. And when you look at what we were doing, which was running submarine communications, running defensive cyber operations in Afghanistan, in support of those sort of things, it doesn't quite mix of it. I'm sorry, it is a critical part of there and can't be viewed in the team. So, in my last year in the role, I actually took the entire division, which is about 3,500 people, out of working in HR, sort of finance, or those sort of business enablement pieces, and we brought them in and set up a command, which is essentially, it's called Joint Capabilities Group, but it's essentially focused on cyber and space. And what it is about fighting the wars of the future across 5 domains, traditionally land, sea, and air, but now cyberspace and space. So, I guess that's illustrating to you the seriousness that defence takes about actually integrating, what goes on in cyberspace, as a key part of its mission, and not just treating it as, a business overhead.
Tony, you've consulted widely. I think it's easier said than done. I think in defence, I think you've got particularly joint capabilities. Bringing those domains together makes sense, but you just can. I see it all the time. That silo mentality on security and the secret squirrel approach is still very common. It doesn't ring true anymore in terms of that's not the best practice. How would you go about, because it's always been people, process and technology, and I think Dan's highlighted that people is number one. And even going back to Ken's question, he starts with I'm fighting the integration fight. So it's always a battle, right? And it shouldn't be that battle. How do we come across that and maybe get the senior leadership to understand it? And I know some recent breaches, it's the CEO that has to take the flak. So surely they're starting to understand this, right?
Yeah, quite often we see security teams sitting over to one side, and they're always the guys who say no. That hasn't changed for 30 years, right? One of the things that organizations who are becoming successful in managing security are doing is pushing those security responsibilities down onto all their teams. So it's not about having a security team over here that does everything to do with security. It's about having security roles inside every team. So they understand the basis of the processes that they're integrating with. When you've got something like a security operations center, it's not about sitting over to one side, just firing alerts at the teams to go, hey, there's something going on, you have to investigate it. It's about enabling processes that allow faster reaction to those alerts that they find, to do things like closing off firewall ports or taking out an intruder or whatever it might be, taking down a dodgy website, adding a filter into your spam filter. Those are the kind of things that make the organization work better and become more resilient. And the buzzword of the day is about cyber resilience. It's not just security, it's about resilience and organizational resilience. And I think, you literally can't patch your way to safety. That's not the approach. It's about finding out what you need to do, prioritizing that workflow, and making sure that all of the different teams that are within those workflows all understand that priority, and they're all singing to the same song.
But that, again, that's cultural change. It's not going to happen over time, but it will require time. One last question here from Dan. And again, if you are having questions, ideally put them in the Q&A. But otherwise, Dan's asked, and it's more on the OT environment, safety after do not deploy patching before safety after the change is verified. How do you approach that challenge? So patching in the IT environment is very different to patching in the OT environment. When we're talking about integrating the vulnerability response and service delivery, are we talking about both environments, particularly for critical infrastructure? They operate in both?
I think definitely from my view. Sorry, Tony.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can jump in, Richard, anytime, but I was just going to say the process that we use for assessing the criticality and the urgency of a vulnerability doesn't change whether it's IT or OT. What changes is the approach you take to making sure the patch isn't going to be disruptive, how you deploy it. Most OT environments understand their own environments well enough to know how to patch it. And that safety first approach, you're still going to use exactly the same processes that you use today. You're not going to automate something that you didn't automate before because it's now got a risk, or there's a vulnerability associated with it. But what you're going to do is have less of that work to do because your vulnerability products are not spitting thousands and thousands of data points at you and you just don't know what to do with them all. They're going to tell you, if you're prioritizing things properly, that you've got 3 things to do today, and those 3 things are your most important things. then you can get on with doing the other stuff that you need to do as an OT administrator or an OT engineer. And that's what it is we're talking about. It's making sure that the right data is prioritized in the right way into the hands of the people that need to do the work.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, to add to that, similar to what I was going to say, is it's not about automating everything, automating what you can to free up that time. So if we've automated the ingestion of the data, the vulnerability risk calculation to understand that's with the CVSS score along with the business criticality to know what's priority. We've automated that work, so you're not now doing that work. So you do now have that time and energy to focus on being able to do the patching. The actual patching part is critical because and automate out patching for those systems that aren't as critical. So maybe if you've got a multi-stack environment, your development environment might get automated patching, but test and production doesn't because you want to go through a different way. But where you can automate the work means you're now freed up time to be able to have that time, to take care on those critical tasks. So automation isn't always about automating everything, but also about automating the decision maker or the insights to be able to have those insightful decisions, to be able to take the care and time when you need to, and automate out the churn and the low level work so that you can spend the time on the higher value work.
Maybe sort of a left of field question, and again, firing questions, particularly on any case studies you want to hear from. But how much skill is in automation? How much skill is required? And I think, Richard, you just said time, because if you get it wrong, you won't know until the end of the process, right, of what that gap is. Yeah, and this is where sort of service providers like Kinetic IT come into play, is you've done it in other settings, you've learnt from the way that these are deployed. But general question to the panel is, how much skill and time is required in automation?
I'm going to take that one to start. Is it varies, and to leverage a case say where, without using the organisation's name, but they've got a large attack surface that they need to scan. They need to comply with SOC-IAC and Essential 8, and there's certain things they need to do there. But their CMDB doesn't sit within their system of action; it sits in another place, so they don't have the data, and the problem looks too big. So to Murray's context earlier of like a massive organization, so where do you start? And it's about starting in a phased approach so that you can then reiterate. Once you get the integrations and stuff set in, depending on what you're automating, if you're automating just that risk calculation and those scores, literally stepping in before this meeting, talking to one of our vulnerability guys around doing that, and it's changing a setting. It's changing a value to say that this is now worth 20 where it used to be worth 10. So being able to set those weightings can be done really fast and pushed out to the teams that are responsible for doing that. It doesn't always need to be the developer or the admin of the system. It can be delegated out to the right people to make those controls. But bringing in those rules that say, yes, I want to watch list. I want to look at this group of all vulnerabilities for Windows and do this remediation. It's low code, no code selecting options. So it becomes really fast to automate that grouping and understanding, to automate that grouping of items, defining the remediation tasks and getting it to the teams. It's not coding, it's not scripting, it's selecting variables in a drop-down list and being able to do that quite simply and rapidly. And so where I'm working with this customer is, let's just bring on one or two tools first. Let's test the process, to Dan's point, have a documented process, but see if it works. Refine, iterate. Now let's bring on the next team, the next tool, and do that and go through that process iteratively, while everyone learns that muscle memory of how to respond and how to bring on that and automate fast, but automate little bits at a time throughout the process, not the whole thing at once.
It's a cultural change, I think, Richard, as much as it is a technology or process change. And I think, when you think about the totality about what you're trying to achieve, it's a big thing for most of our customers, but you've got to start somewhere and start small and actually get in a good rhythm of starting to roll this out further and further across an organization. So just start somewhere that has high value, where you'll start to see a fast return on both your time and your investment, and then iterate slowly over time.
You can build prototypes for some of these cost savings that you're looking at as well. Taking the data out of some of the tools, running it through a model that you've knocked up in Excel, for example, just to show some basic context and the type of savings that you're going to get. It is quite easy to model. When it comes to then doing the implementation inside tools like ServiceNow, there are plugins in ServiceNow that help you do some of this automation, so we can integrate, and this is what we've done in a number of customers, is integrate the vulnerability scanners into the vulnerability response module, and then build that business logic into it with the routing, so that, you know, from the point of it being detected inside the scanner, the CVSS score that comes out of the scanner is automatically adjusted based on the, you know, is it external, is it internal, is it exploitable? Once you've got that and you understand then the context of it, so is it a Java thing, is it an Oracle thing, then you can route it to the right place. And by just putting those rules in around your automations, then that's streamlining the process and taking that load off the people who would have otherwise done that work manually.
I'm just going to take you, that was very technical, Tony, in terms of that terminology, but it was good. But for me, and back to maybe to Murray, in your role dealing with clients and leadership team, the output there is saving time, reducing costs, and also managing risk, right? That's the conversation that the executive teams want to be hearing. And if they are hearing that, they'll support those security teams.
Yeah, definitely. You know, look, a good IT leaders, you know, key role is actually, you know, about interpretation of you know, the technical aspects and communicating in a logical and thoughtful way to the senior executives in the company, you know, to have meaningful impact. You know, if they're not doing that, if they're stuck in the weeds, they're not going to have the cut through. So, you know, aligning, you know, your IT management layer is in many ways just as important as the teams are actually making it look good by being on the tools.
How much knowledge transfer is the team having with your clients? So, Richard, you talked about you were working side by side with your client. That knowledge transfer, there's I suppose my point here is bringing in, no security team has all of the skills, and you know, if they do, it's probably in a financial sector and the like, and even then they still use third-party suppliers. But bringing in teams that are experienced like Kinetic IT, there's a knowledge transfer there, obviously. So there's an awareness and a training aspect to this, particularly within these platforms like ServiceNow.
Yeah, I think to tie that back into Ken's question as well is not just Kinetic IT coming in, dropping a tool, walking away. It's being part of a broader team. So we don't just come in and deliver that. We actually bring in those customer roles, those customer personas into the program of works, into that project. They're part of the journey. They're understanding, not just providing requirements, walk away, come back in, you know, however many weeks and something's delivered. They're part of the journey. So they're actually there through the scenario-based training that we do for user acceptance testing. So instead of just going and does this button go red when you click that thing, running through a scenario, which actually ends up being their work practice. So we try to conduct UAT in a scenario thing. So from a vulnerability being detected through to remediation, how do you actually respond? How does it go to the different teams? And do that as part of the UAT to bring them on the journey, have them actually understand it, be there through hypercare and adoption success to ensure that they're there, they've got someone to ask. But in a lot of places as well, so we don't just do the technology jobs, we're there ongoing and longer term relationships, administering the systems and working with them in the longer term, but trying to make them part of that journey as well, so that they're there building the knowledge within the system as well. So having the help tips, not just one big, here's an as-built or a process document that you do, contextual help. When you're on this screen, where do I check this, whatever, there's a little help. You can click on the little help button. That information's there at your fingertips when you need it. So it's a multifaceted approach in terms of being able to transfer that knowledge. But the key thing is back to the people and the organizational change management is making them part of the journey, not someone that just gets a delivery at the end of a project.
Nice. Look, we've just got a few minutes to go. Again, last opportunity for questions from the audience, but I might finish off with what are the general pain points that you're hearing with clients? You deal with a lot, and again, this is critical infrastructure focused. So these are relatively large enterprise, and you probably, most, or even someone like Tony and Murray will be dealing with the CISOs and the C-suite. Just an overview of the pain points that you're generally hearing and market observations that you're hearing back from clients. Where are they struggling, or where are they doing well? Maybe to Tony first.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'll pass to Tony
Murray.
because I'm still learning the business. So I found today has been really, really useful because I'm taking notes. So I'm here to hear from Tony as well because I haven't got round to all the clients yet.
I think Beautiful. Tony might have a bit more, so I'll jump in with just two things: is volume and the processes, trying to do it the old way and not trying to refine their processes for the new way of working to continue doing it. But we've always done it like this. Let's do it newer and smarter.
Nice.
So,
Go, Tony.
look, within critical infrastructure, undoubtedly, there are old pieces of equipment. A lot of that equipment can't be patched. So what you need to be considering is how do you actually deal with something that has got a critical vulnerability, but you can't patch it. So that is one of the key issues that critical infrastructure deals with. Oftentimes to fix it, you need to traipse out into the middle of a field with a screwdriver, remove something and replace it with something new. You also need to consider whether that thing that you're putting in is now network enabled and it's going to give you an exposure that you didn't have before. So because it's been released as a patch it over the internet type new IoT device. So a lot of those issues are still really prescient. We're dealing with them all the time. And I think that's the point of this webinar, is that we're actually talking about reducing the volume of noise that the teams are swamped with so that they can actually consider how they're going to fix some of these bigger problems. If you have to suddenly go and patch 1,000 different systems because some new releases come out from your Siemens systems are all out of date or something like that, then your team isn't going to know how to deal with that. So instead, what we're saying is follow a process that allows you to trim down and prioritize the type of work that you're going to do. And then you can go and do the program for replacing those things without all of this other concern coming down from the C-levels that are saying, what are you doing about this thing that's running on the news? We're all scared. Everybody's going to die. Yeah. That's not the case. You've got an answer for them. You can say, this is what we're doing. This is what we've assessed. This is the risk that we're actually carrying as our organization. And this is the plan going forward. And if you've got that kind of, succinct advice that you can push back up again, but you've also got the technical backing, the scientific discovery that you've done behind it to understand that you are actually solving the problem, then you've tied up both ends.
Nice. Tony, nice way to finish. There is one last question, given we've literally got 2 minutes. Is event management separate from or complementary to vulnerability management? So I think event management being incident management, it is different, but it's part of vulnerability management.
Yeah, look, if event management it's a broad topic, and from an IT service management point of view, it's even broader than security, right? So it's incidents are broad. If we're talking specifically, exactly right. And if we're talking specifically about cyber event management, oftentimes that's the alerts that something is going on in your network. They may be triggered by a vulnerability. So we need to consider that they are connected to each other, but they are different processes. Events usually are triggered by alarms going off within systems. Then you need to investigate those alarms. And again, those type of processes, they do swamp security teams. Yeah. You're often faced with hundreds of alarms that you need to go and investigate. So we need the same kind of processes to apply here. We need business context. We need to understand criticality. We need to roll out false positives. If we can do that, then the teams that are dealing with those events are able to actually focus on work that's more important.
Wonderful. Well, look, on that note, we will conclude. We're at the top of the hour. Please, a warm round of applause. You can do that here if you clap your hands as you do. But please thank our panel, Dan Sparta, Principal Service Integration, Tony Campbell, Principal Security Consulting and Advisory, Richard Cook, Senior Consultant, Service Integration, and I'll embarrass him again, best till last, Murray Thompson, AMCSC, Group Executive Advisory and Transformation. Gents, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you to the audience that made the time, and the recording will be available and sent out to you at least, or hopefully by tomorrow morning, or within 24 hours. But on that note, I'll conclude this session and thank you very much. And thank you to Kinetic IT for sponsoring this session. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Nice one, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you.